Hello, you having a bad day? Or you need to make a big decision, or you're a little bit confused about what to do in the future? Well, it's time to sit down and have an executive session with yourself. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. Let's go. All right, welcome. Now, the concept of an executive session with yourself is essentially where you have a quiet, contemplative session with yourself to go and break through a big decision or some anxiety that you've got or some other issue that you're dealing with. Now, this typically takes place when you go for a drive or you have a shower or you're sitting in your backyard, and it's really useful for working through tough decisions or deciding on a future strategy or a piece of work or facing challenges in your private life or your professional life or dealing with certain kinds of anxiety and stress. Now, weirdly, this is something I've been doing for a number of years. You know, when I get myself worked up about something, I'd find it just really helpful to go for a drive and think through the problem without being distracted by my phone or other people. But then I read that John Lewis, who's a really famous American politician and civil rights activist, he referred to this kind of way of doing things as an executive session with yourself. He would comment that he would go into a quiet place and then he'd sit down with himself and say, quote, "Listen, self, this is what you must do. This is where you must go." So little did I know that other people seemingly do this. And I bet you anything that many of you have tried this in the past, or you may know of people who do this. And it's a really powerful way of working through issues. So in this video, what I want to walk through is a 5-step approach to having an executive session with yourself. But let me first of all give you a couple of examples of how I tend to use it. So for example, one of the things that I know about myself is that when I get tired and exhausted, I tend to start manifesting all kinds of self-doubt. I'll think, am I a good dad, a good husband? Am I any good at my job? Do my clients like the work that I do? Is the content that I put out any good? I'll have all of this kind of self-doubt that usually is from being tired. So what I do is I'll go out and have a drive. That's the best place for me. And I'll walk through these issues. I'll challenge myself about whether my self-doubt is reasonable. Is there evidence behind it? Should I be thinking about it this way? It's really helpful. Another example is when I need to kind of take a step back out of all of the detail and think about a problem. So for example, I was working with a client about 3 months ago on a really tricky problem that we're trying to figure out in their business. And we were wrapped up in all the details and how everything was connected together. And what I did is I went into my back garden with a piece of paper and a pen, and I just took a step back and started walking through how to think about this problem differently via an executive session with myself. Now, the crux of what makes this executive session technique so powerful is that you train one part of your brain to be like a partner or like a coach to guide you through how to find that ultimate conclusion. Now, before I walk through these 5 steps for how to do this, just bear one thing in mind, is that this is not going to happen overnight. It takes time to master this as a skill. And the one thing I definitely recommend you do is to try and have an executive session with yourself at least once a week. The more you do it, the more you get to practice, the faster you'll be able to pick it up. All right, so step 1 is that you need to get away. You've got to go to a place where, first of all, there's no distractions, where there's not going to be any people, there's no email that's going to get in your way, no computer, no cell phone notifications, a place where you can have absolute peace. And importantly, a place where you can speak to yourself out loud. Now, this might seem a little bit weird, but verbalizing your thought process and verbalizing this conversation you have with yourself is really important in helping to kind of work through these ideas, work through these problems, to challenge yourself and ultimately find the right kind of conclusion. So you need to make sure you go somewhere where you can talk to yourself out loud and not come across as a bit crazy. So for example, I wouldn't walk around my local neighborhood to have an executive session with myself because there's people who walk their dogs, and I might seem a little bit weird if I'm chuntering away to myself walking around the place. Although, here's a little pro tip. If you put some earbuds in and hold a phone, it can have the illusion of having a normal conversation, but you're actually just faking a phone call and having an executive session with yourself. So think of places where you can go, where you can have that kind of open thought process. For example, for me, I like to take a drive, or you could have a shower, or you could have a bath, or you could go for a walk or a run in an open space where there aren't people milling around. You could sit in your back garden, or you could go to a beach or a riverbank. Pick a place that's good for you, that's convenient for you to get to. And importantly, this is really important, switch off all of your devices. One thing that we wrestle with in our lives is device addiction. Like, how many times have you been kind of sat with having a conversation with a person, you just, as a motor reaction, you pick your phone up and check it to see if there's any notifications. We tend to do this, okay? So switch off your phone. Switch off, these smartwatches. Make sure your computer's not there. Make sure that you're not going to be pestered for half an hour or an hour, however much time you've got, so you can really focus on having that peace with yourself. All right, so step number 2 is that we want to put our brain into incognito mode. Now, there's a web browser called Chrome. It's got a feature in it where you can open up a window called an incognito window, and it has no knowledge of any of your logins or your accounts or your credentials, okay? So if you want to browse the internet and it doesn't know that you're logged in, you use an incognito window. Or, frankly, what most people tend to use incognito windows for is for looking at slightly salty material on the internet without leaving a trace. You know what I'm talking about. Now, we want to take a similar approach to our brain. And what we want to do is break our brain into 2 different buckets. This bucket is ourselves. It's our thoughts, our feelings, our experience, our anxieties, our desires, all of those different pieces. But this bucket over here is going to play the role of a head coach, right? Literally, head coach. Pun intended. Now, this bucket over here, you want to treat as somebody you've never met. They don't know who you are. They don't know your experience. They don't know your fears, your dreams, or any of that kind of stuff. They're a brand new person. And what we're going to do in the next step is we're going to facilitate a conversation between yourself and this head coach that you've got over here to work through the question, the challenge, the anxiety that you've got. Now, this is thoroughly unintuitive for many people, and you may never have done this before, putting your mind into this kind of personality of somebody else who's asking you questions. But this is where the practice comes in. This is why I'd like you to do this at least once a week. And gradually, bit by bit, you will get used to it. You'll learn how to do this. And when you can do it, they become a guide, a coach, a critic, a supporter. It's a really, really, really powerful way to approach solving problems. So this rather neatly leads us on to our 3rd step, and this is to start the conversation. Now, as a recap, we've got these 2 sides of our brain. There's you, your ideas, your perspectives, your experience, your anxieties, your dreams, and then you've got your head coach, somebody you don't know, who's brand new here, who wants to have a conversation with you. The first step that we need to do is to have your head coach ask you a question. Okay, so let me give you an example. Imagine you're feeling a certain amount of self-doubt. You're not sure if you're very good at what you're doing, and that's what the purpose of the executive session is. So your coach should say, okay, Jono, how are you feeling? Just like you're meeting someone brand new. And your response to that may be, well, I just don't feel very good right now. I feel like I'm not offering a lot of value in the world. I feel like sometimes people are very friendly to me and they actually think I'm not very good at this, and I think I've got a lot to learn and I'm behind a lot of people in terms of where I should be. That's the kind of reaction that you may have. Now, as another example, maybe your executive session is because you're trying to think of new goals and direction and strategy for your community, your business, whatever you're building, okay? So what would your head coach ask you? Well, probably something like, okay, well, what do you really want to achieve? Like, what's your broader ambition here? And your response to that may be, when I think about it, I really want to focus on building growth, building a customer base or building a large community of people. That might be the response. So what we're doing here is that we're starting the conversation with your coach, who, remember, doesn't know you, doesn't know your experience, your perspectives, your ideas, your anxieties, your goals, asking a question that you can then respond to, okay? And you want to respond as honestly as you can when thinking that through. So another example could be if you're dealing with a difficult person, someone at work or in a community or in your family. Your coach's first question may be, okay, so what is the core of this problem between you and this individual? And your response may be, well, you know what, I think it's probably about communication. We just don't seem to be able to communicate very effectively with each other. Now, this is where we really get into the juice of it. When you respond to your head coach after that first question, ask yourself, was I honest? Was I authentic? Was I speaking frankly about what's going on? Because remember, you're just talking to yourself, so you can be as open and as safe and as honest as you want to be. So with the last example of dealing with a difficult person, when your coach asked the question, what's the core of the issue here? And you said, I think it might be a communication breakdown. Maybe it's not that. Maybe if you were to speak really openly, you could say to your coach, you know what? I don't like them as a human being. I find them aggressive and unnecessary and mean-spirited. That's why I'm struggling with this. Now, that's something you might not say to somebody else because you don't want to come across as petty and childish. So you'd come up with a more rational reason, such as that we have a communication breakdown. So this is where we want to start training ourselves. Be open, be honest in that response and in every response that you have with your head coach as you go through this process. Now, I just want to take a quick moment that if you're enjoying this video, if you're finding this useful, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps me out. And of course, hit that subscribe button. And if you really want to go the full mile, hit the notification bell, and then I'll notify you when I've got new videos coming out. All right, so let's now move on to step 4 of 5. And this is where we discuss and debate the issue with your head coach, okay? Now, the key thing here is to challenge yourself and to challenge your thinking. So let's recap this, okay? Let's say we're talking about the dealing with difficult people conversation, okay? So your head coach says, okay, what's the core of the issue here? And you say, I think it's communication, right? But then what's your head coach going to do to respond to that? Like, what would a real coach, somebody who's really looking out for your best interests say? Well, they may say, for example, okay, you've outlined the problems with this other person, what you don't like about them, what's causing the issues for you. But what role do you play in the conflict? What challenges are you bringing that we can think about resolving? Now, that would be a very, very specific and slightly pointed question in the real world. But that's what we can do with an executive session with yourself, is you can train yourself to ask those kinds of tough questions. And it's when you ask yourself those tough questions when the real value of this technique really comes out, because then you're thinking critically, thinking objectively about your perspectives. So let's go through another couple of examples. My example earlier on of self-doubt. If you're feeling a lot of self-doubt, not sure if you're very good at what you do, well, the original head coach question was, okay, Jono, how are you feeling? And I said, I'm feeling like I don't really have a lot to offer in the world. Well, maybe your head coach could reply there and say, okay, well, what evidence do you have of these issues that you're saying? Like, if you feel like you don't have a lot of value in the world, do you have any data to back that up? Have you had anyone reach out to you and say that there's problems? Have you had any customers who have cancelled or community members who have left because of this? Like, what can you use to back up your claim? Now, again, that would be a very pointed question in the real world, but that's what we want to do, is we want to be constantly questioning our judgment and identifying the rationale, because that helps us to step back from the emotion of the issue and to really focus on what's going on. Now, another example could be our kind of new goals and direction and strategy that we talked about earlier on, okay? So in that example earlier on, the head coach said, okay, what do you really want to achieve? And I responded, well, I want to build growth. Like, that's the thing that I find really important. But maybe your head coach could respond to that and say, well, why is it growth? Why is that so important to you and not something else that you're also passionate about? Again, this is the crux of where this approach is really valuable, is that often when we're not having this conversation with ourselves, we tend to double down on the feelings and how we feel and how we're emotionally reacting to something. And what your head coach is doing is asking you to get to the heart of the issue, the evidence, the data, the rationale for what you're saying, so we can start unpicking that and finding out what's under the surface. So when you're having this conversation with your head coach, what you want to do is to focus on 3 main areas. The first thing is the rationale, as I just mentioned. Challenge yourself. Like, why do you think this way? Why do you have this perspective? What evidence, what data, what things have you seen recently back up what you're saying? The second area that you want to focus on is trying to separate the logic versus the emotion. Especially when we're talking about things like self-doubt and anxiety and things like that, we tend to become very emotional and we tend to feel the pain that we're experiencing there, as opposed to thinking logically through what's happening. So use your head coach as someone who can constantly reinforce and kind of reintroduce logic into the equation to walk through that decision making. And then the third thing you want to do as you're having these conversations, and this is where you're on your own part of your brain now, this is you, is to be constantly open to new ideas. Is that when your head coach challenges you with a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at things, is to say, oh, well, maybe you're right about that, because that's where the real transformation tends to occur in actual coaching, which is where somebody who you trust, who's kind, who's helping you work through an issue, is able to help you think a different way. Not that they tell you what the solution is, that you land on the solution yourself. I'll give you an example of this. So a while back, I was working with a company and they had a marketing lead. And her and I didn't really see eye to eye on what we should be doing in the strategy. She was a great person. I think we had a good personal relationship, but there was a lot of tension in terms of the decision making and the strategy. And I was trying to think of how I can unblock this. So I went for an executive session with myself, went for a drive, and I was thinking things through. And I was looking at everything initially, from everything I'm doing to find a solution, everything that I'm bringing to the pulpit, I guess you could say, to solve the problem. But then I started thinking, my executive head coach was saying, yeah, but, look at it from her perspective. Like, what's in it for her? Like, why should she be coming here and engaging with you? What is the benefit that this work is going to bring to her department, to her goals, to her career ambitions? And when I switched it on its head like that, and I went back to her and started having conversations, looking at it more from that perspective, we really saw a bit of a breakthrough happening. So being open to these new ideas is really, really important. Okay, and then the fifth and final step here is to focus on finding practical solutions. So ideally, when you're having this conversation with your head coach, you're going to be bouncing backwards and forwards, discussing and exploring a particular topic. But sometimes these topics can be quite big. So for example, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was having an executive session with myself about my business and what I want to do this year. As I tape this video, it's at the beginning of the year. And I realized, okay, there's a lot to think about here. There's my consulting business, there's my training business, there's my content business. How do I want to focus on this? So I decided in this conversation with my head coach, I'm going to break it into 3 different buckets. And I started thinking about the consulting piece first. Like, what do I want to achieve? Where do I want to go? What efficiencies do I want to bring to my business? And I started focusing on that first. Before you move on to each additional topic in this conversation with yourself, come away with specific solutions, right? So for example, with my consulting, I said, okay, well, I want to fix up these parts of my process. I want to focus on these changes to my website. I want to do some market research with some of my existing clients so I can figure out how I can add more value to future clients as well. So the important thing here is that you're not just waffling with your head coach, you're finding solutions. And then you think, okay, I'm going to jot that down, I'm going to jot this down. Or if you're driving, obviously stop and jot that down. Don't jot things down while driving. That can cause bad things to happen. But you're focusing on finding these practical solutions. And then when you've got the practical solutions for one bit of your executive session, then you can move on to the next one. So then I'd start thinking about training, for example. Okay, what do I want to do there? Increasing the number of courses that I'm putting out, improving the quality of the course experience, getting more input from market research from what my students want. All of those kinds of things I put down as solutions there. And the ideal scenario here is that at the end of this executive session that you have, and it may be a 30-minute session, or I've done this sometimes for 3 hours, is that you end up with a bunch of scribbled down bullet points and next steps that you can focus on putting into action as an outcome, as a set of next steps for whatever you're doing. So let's revisit the example we had earlier on of having conflict with a person. Well, maybe you identify their issues, but you also identify your own. You brainstorm some new ways in which you can communicate with that particular individual, and then you reach out to that person to explore how you can put some of these pieces into action right away. Okay? That would be a good set of next steps, a good set of reasonable low-hanging fruit that you can start with at the end of that executive session. Another example could be where we were talking about self-doubt. Not sure if you've got a lot of value in the world. Well, maybe your coach says, okay, well, you're feeling a lot of this, but what's the actual data that you've got to back up that you may have a problem here? So maybe the outcome here is focusing on collecting more objective data, maybe tracking customer or community feedback, inviting some input from trusted friends and colleagues so you can furnish yourself with this information and really objectively know whether you've got a problem or whether you're just kind of worried about it. So in conclusion, the flow that I've walked through in this video is to get away from distractions, put your brain into incognito mode and train that part of your brain to be that head coach, to be a personality that can ask you questions, that can challenge you, to explore those ideas in a safe and open way with yourself. Is to start that conversation, to ask that question, to respond to that question, to challenge yourself on those questions, on those responses. Your head coach is there to really probe and investigate what's really happening here, to find practical solutions, and then to put those practical solutions into a format, into a means that you can actually get started with them. Now, this all may seem a little abstract, a bit esoteric, a bit strange, but it really is a powerful technique, but it needs practice. So just start somewhere, have a go. It won't be perfect the first time you have a go at it, but as John Lewis said, it can be a really powerful tool in your arsenal that you can use for helping yourself to work through big questions, big challenges, big decisions, and really moving forward. All right, so I'd love your feedback. I'd love your thoughts. Be sure to pop them into the comments down there. If you've got questions, I'm always happy to help answer them. Of course, give this video a quick like if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel and tap that little notification bell to stay updated with new videos. And I'll see you next time.